How are vampires in your world made? Are they bitten? Do they rise from their graves? Let's talk about your vampire project.
What is it that causes a vampire to rise from their grave? You probably already have a pretty good idea of what it is you want to do, and that's probably based on your favorite vampire story from the past, whether that be the Vampire Chronicles, or Twilight, or Lost Boys. The current mythology is that a new vampire is made when a vampire drinks the blood of a victim and then feeds that victim the vampire's own blood in return. It's sort of a blood communion, a symbiotic blood relationship that forms between master and fledgling. But where does this idea come from? If we trace it back through history, we actually wind up at Dracula. Prior to that, there was no sharing of blood at all to create a vampire. It doesn't happen in Carmilla, it doesn't happen in Polidori's vampire, it doesn't happen in folklore as far as I've been able to find. So really we have to credit this to Bram Stoker. And even then, we only see it happen once in the book. And that is when the vampire hunters come bursting into Mina's bedchambers and they find her with Dracula. She has just drank blood from Dracula after him having bitten her. And then he flies away, and she then starts the transformation into a vampire. But that's Mina. There was also Lucy. Lucy was turned into a vampire earlier in the book, and we never saw Dracula share his blood with her, and he visited her several times. Now, it could be that Dracula just gave Lucy his blood off stage or off chapter, or it could be that Mina was something special, and that him sharing his blood with her was making her into some sort of a greater vampire, and potentially this was the same thing that he did with his brides previously. Obviously, we don't know for sure. From a storytelling perspective, the sharing of blood is good for drama. It can go either way. It's a forced interaction between the vampire and the fledgling. If the vampire is malevolent, then it is forcing its own blood into the victim, turning them into a monster without their choice. Or the alternative to that is that the benevolent vampire can give the victim the choice, most likely while that victim is lying dying in the vampire's arms. Do you want to walk in darkness forever and know the taste of only human blood? That makes for some really powerful drama. I mean, who can forget that amazing scene between Louis and Lestat, an interview with the vampire? Or when Darla changes Angel into a vampire. That's good stuff. And on that point, the sharing of blood also has a sexual connotation that makes it well suited for the romance genre. The vampire has to share that which is most precious to it with its immortal paramour, forever linking them together in this dark existence, this immortality. And this may very well be your choice for how one vampire creates another, and that's perfectly fine. It's readily familiar to audience members. But for the sake of investigation, let's look at some other options, shall we? Prior to the 1970s, it was a hard and fast rule that a new vampire was created anytime a vampire bit another person. If you look at the old Hammer films, It's full of lilting maidens in white gowns who are being bitten by Dracula or some other vampire, and then rising again from their grave with fanged smiles, causing the strapping English male protagonists to have to force themselves to drive a stake through their hearts despite their love for who the women used to be.
Nowadays, hopefully we have a little more equal opportunity between vampire victims and who rises from their graves, but the idea is still the same, that anyone bitten would rise as a vampire.
Sometimes the person bitten wouldn't rise as a vampire until after they had been buried. And you see that a lot in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is why she has to go on patrol every night past every cemetery in Sunnydale. Sometimes a victim would be bitten and they would have time to understand what they were about to turn into. That was certainly the case in the book Dracula, but it's also been seen to take place in a much faster time span, almost like a zombie bite. And it lends itself well to that because you have a character who knows that they're going to turn into a vampire, and they have the choice of whether or not to tell their friends about it. Whether they want to try and ignore it and keep it a secret, putting all of their friends at risk, or do they tell their friends and say, all right, you've got me for the next couple of hours, but then once I change, you have to drive a stake through my heart. And this is very well delivered in From Dusk Till Dawn. But come on. If every single person a vampire bit turned into a vampire, then the world would have been overrun with vampires in like a matter of weeks. Doesn't it make a little more sense that the vampire is able to control who he or she bites becomes a vampire, as opposed to just leaving a plague of vampires in their wake as they move on to the next city? There is, in Dungeons & Dragons, there is a rule, actually back in 2nd edition D&D, for those who care. There's a rule in the game that if a vampire visits a victim and drinks their blood over the course of consecutive nights, they can then turn that person into a special type of consort vampire that is like a vampire bride or vampire husband. And then that vampire, although not as strong as the master who turned them, is stronger than any other vampires in the master's retinue and has the ability to command the master's armies and command the defenses of the master's castle, and is basically sort of like second only to the master themselves. And that is possibly an interpretation from what Dracula was doing to Mina, and the idea that, you know, Dracula came and visited Lucy several times. He might have come and visited Mina several times. Going back to a book that predates Dracula called The Mysterious Guest, the vampire character comes and visits his victim on subsequent nights, and only after having drank her blood a couple different times does she start to make the change. So this is, in terms of codifying vampire behavior into rules, this is actually a pretty good option. Now, in more recent Dungeons & Dragons, in 5th edition, again, for those of you who care, the rules are slightly different in that a vampire can change a victim into a vampire just by biting them and drinking their blood. And these are sort of like minion vampires. But if the master vampire so chooses, he can take any of those minion vampires, and if he feeds that minion vampire his own blood, then that minion vampire elevates from just a bloodthirsty sort of undead monster to actually regaining their cognitive thought processes and elevating them into a master vampire that has full breadth of all of the vampire capabilities. And that's also a good option for how does one make a new vampire that is different than other vampires. So Stephanie Meyer actually came up with a spin on this for the Twilight stories, where Edward has a special venom that he injects into Bella with his bite that then turns her into a vampire. So the vampires can decide who it is that they want to turn to be like them. And there's no real blood drinking necessary from either party. On the flip side of that, we have the Lost Boys, in which the character of David, who is sort of the leader of the biker gang of vampires, wants to induct the character of Michael, who is still human, wants to turn him into a vampire and bring him into the gang. But to do that, David has to trick Michael into drinking David's vampire blood. And once Michael does that, then he starts to make the transformation into a vampire. And this is rare in the fact that Michael is never bitten. No one ever drinks his blood in the movie, and yet he's the one who goes through the change. So those are a number of ways that one vampire can create another vampire through the bite or the drinking of blood or the feeding of blood. But what about methods that have nothing to do with any of that? Prior to the vampire appearing in literature, there were all sorts of reasons why someone might rise from their grave. Suicides were a very real threat. Somebody who killed themselves could rise from their grave as a vampire and start feeding off of their family members. Being buried in unconsecrated ground could do it. Being buried at a crossroads would make someone rise as a vampire. Or, if you thought somebody was going to rise as a vampire, you could go and bury them at a crossroads, and so when they rose from their grave, they would be confused as to which way to go. And the hope was that they would wander off down the wrong road to a different village. And that's kind of a dick move if you think about it. If I buried someone I thought was going to rise as a vampire at, say, the 110-101 interchange here in Los Angeles, hoping that when that vampire rose from their grave they would wander off to Pasadena instead of Hollywood, that would make me an asshole. If you were born with a caul, which is the amniotic sac still over your head or on your body, that would mean that you would become a vampire. And that obscure little bit of lore was handled very well in Hemlock Grove. If you were born on Sunday, ask your mom. You may get this whole vampire thing for free. If you were cursed by a witch. If you weren't baptized. If you were engaged, but then died before your wedding night, a la the Bride of Corinth. Or if you were just an awful person in life. And there's something kind of compelling about that last one, isn't there? Like there's a morality to it. And maybe that's what caused Dracula to ultimately rise from his grave. The sheer weight of his bloody deeds in life. And ultimately, Stoker never tells us how Dracula became a vampire. He alludes to the Scholomance, which is the school of black magic, which Dracula attended, as did evidently several of his family members. But he never expressly says that that's where Dracula became a vampire, or even if that had anything to do with it. Was there a vampire who turned Dracula? Like in Dracula Untold? Or did Dracula make himself a vampire? like in that amazing opening scene of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. Sort of a self-made original, a protean vampire. But there's also another way that has nothing to do with rising from the grave that has become rather popular in the last couple decades. And that is vampires who are not made, but who are born. I suppose you could trace this idea of lineages of vampires that are completely different from humankind back to the sort of pulpy magazines of the 70s, 60s and 70s, where you get like Vampirella, who is actually an alien from the planet of Draculon, and vampires are a race from outer space. Obviously that's from a totally different generation. That's not quite the vampire zeitgeist as it is now, but you know, you can also look at a movie like Life Force in the 80s, which was kind of a similar idea, where you had this ship that like rode in with Halley's Comet, and on board were these space vampires that come down to Earth, and pretty soon everyone they're biting are turning into these monstrous creatures. If you like young Patrick Stewart and a female lead who never has any clothes on, I would say give it a watch. It was so ridiculous and so expensive that it completely bankrupted the studio that that made it. And if you're interested in that story, which is amazing unto itself, I recommend Maven of the Eventide's review of Life Force, which is mwah. So check that out for sure. But Vampires from Space is kind of the sort of sci-fi version of what we're talking about here. There's also more of a lo-fi, science-based vampire origin, which would be, you know, something more along the vein of, you know, like I Am Legend or Sci-Fi's Van Helsing or The Passage or The Strain, where it's a virus that changes people into a completely different creature that is no longer compatible with mankind. But if we want to go a more spooky or sort of supernatural road, then we get into something that's like Blade. And in Blade, and there is so much good vampire stuff in Blade, but one of the very cool overarching things in Blade is that there are two different castes of vampires, and their society is stratified between these two castes. And one caste are the people who are bitten. They were just mortals. They were bitten by vampires and become vampires through the bite. Those who are turned. And then there are those vampires who are born. And they are referred to as purebloods. And they are pretty much a separate race entirely. And they are the ones who rule with all the power, and anyone who is turned are sort of second-class citizens. So the film's main villain, who is Deacon Frost, is a vampire who is part of the cast who were turned. So he and all of his friends are tired of being second-class citizens, and they essentially created a vampire terrorist organization meant to overthrow the ruling government of the True Bloods. And that is amazing stuff. And I haven't even mentioned the main characters of the movie yet. So that's all just setup and background and texture and flavor, and that's amazing. There is, and this is something you're probably going to hear me say numerous times, but there's a trope in Hollywood these days that basically says that the villain is the hero of their own story. And that is good writing advice. However, it has been taken and used incorrectly a number of times in a number of films. And you'll know it when you see it, because you'll be watching a villain character who basically does these horrible, horrible things, but then they have a sad backstory that you find out. And that just makes for a muddled, sort of a Band-Aid way of trying to buy some pathos for your villain. But in Blade, Deacon Frost has an objective that humanizes him. We can completely understand that he doesn't want to spend the rest of eternity being constantly stepped on and spit on by the caste above him. But yet at the same time, he doesn't ever come across as a decent guy. We still recognize that he is the villain, and that's where the sweet spot lies. And it's so rare that we ever get a good working example of that in a villain. So special thanks to David Goyer and Stephen Norrington for really sticking the landing on him. But for as dense and delicious as Blade is, it's still a story that is told within 2 hours. If you're looking for something that gives you some very interesting born vampires versus turned vampires, that takes its time and really develops its stuff, I would like to direct you to Richelle Mead's Vampire Academy series. Now, there was a movie that was made of book 1 in the sort of post-Twilight, looking for another YA vampire franchise. And it's not that the movie is bad, but I would recommend that you read the book first and then watch the movie second. And the reason for that is because they were hoping to make a whole 6-movie franchise based on the story, they tried to cram every single bit of that book into a 2-hour movie. And what you're left with is characters literally running back and forth, just like speaking expository dialogue as fast as they possibly can, and even running out of breath at times to try and cram all this stuff into one movie. So it's better if you read the book first, so you can really breathe with the material before you go into watching the movie. In Vampire Academy, Richelle Mead takes sort of an obscure part of Romanian vampire folklore and blows it up into a complete modern-day vampire society. And the bit of folklore that she pulled is an idea that there are 2 different types of vampires. There are the moroi, who are living vampires, and then there are strigoi, which are undead vampires. And so Richelle basically came up with this idea based on that, where the moroi are true-born vampires. They are living beings. They're separate from humans. They're a completely different race. But they are alive, and they have certain vampire-ish traits where they don't like the sunlight. They do have to drink blood, but not all the time. They're a little bit stronger, a little bit faster. They live a little bit longer than normal humans. And they also age at on a continual spectrum from child to old age and eventually die. But every single moroi vampire can at any time choose to embrace their darker side. But it's a one-way ticket, and if they go that route, then they become a strigoi, which is an undead vampire that is like the vampires that we understand them to be. They stop aging, they become extremely powerful, very strong, only drink blood. They are dead. They have stopped living. But they are also really evil. So that makes for a completely different dichotomy in vampire society. And then add to that the moroi, the living vampires, can interbreed with humans. And in every one of those cases, it produces a dhampir, which we will talk about in a later episode. But they are half-breeds, half vampire, half human. So these dhampir become the bodyguards for the moroi. And the dhampir age at a normal rate, but they're extremely fast and they're extremely strong, and when they're trained properly, they can be these super badass bodyguards. So you have this sort of aristocracy of the moroi living vampires being protected by half vampires from the strigoi, which are the undead vampires. And that is really good stuff. That is a fully fleshed out vampire society and world that takes place modern day, but it's really intricate, and it's something that we've never seen before, and it is based on states of vampires and how they become the way they become. So that's really complex stuff and very well executed. Richelle is an amazing writer. The idea that becoming a full undead vampire is a choice that every living vampire has to make, and it basically boils down to personal morality. That's really interesting. And essentially that's what we're trying to do here, is to take the vampire genre and make it interesting, make it compelling, do new things with it without straying so far away from what it is that we love about it. So for your vampire project, maybe your vampires are bitten and turned, maybe they are born, or maybe they're the result of a witch's curse. Maybe a vampire is just a type of permanent demonic possession. Maybe your vampires were made from having read a book of dark things, something like Marvel's Darkhold, or Dungeons & Dragons' The Book of Vile Darkness, or Lovecraft's The Necronomicon. Maybe there's a chalice in a forgotten temple somewhere that some ancient vampire god left there, and anyone who drinks from it immediately becomes a vampire. Maybe vampirism is transferred in dreams. Maybe there was a battle between two demons, and any mortals who saw it immediately were turned into vampires. So use what's familiar, or come up with something completely new. But whatever you do, make it yours. And tell us about it. There's a place for that. That's the comments. Tell us about how your vampires are made. Or if you want to go on social media and do it, then just hashtag it YVP for your vampire project so we know how to find it. So, for your vampire dollars, I know this is going to come as a shock after the monologue I just did, but I'm going to recommend the Vampire Academy series of books, of which there are 6. I only have 3 here because I can only fit that many in my hands. But you should know they are young adult. They're about teenage girls, and those teenage girls do meet some very hot boys. Having said that, it is expertly written. And this is one of many series that came out around and after Twilight was such a huge phenomenon, but it really stands out as an exceptional vampire story. Richelle Mead is excellent at taking a genre that has very specific tropes in it that usually guys my age are not really all that interested in reading, but taking those and then transcending them into a story that is way more than what you or I would expect from a young adult vampire series. So there are 6 books in the series, and then there is a spin-off series that follows a secondary character. That series is called Bloodlines, and that also runs for 6 books. And those are by Richelle Mead, and they are very much worth your vampire dollars. And remember, book first, movie second.
And not only that, but since I've recorded this episode, it has been announced that Vampire Academy is coming to streaming in the form of an episodic show on Peacock. And they've announced the cast and everything. So, if you want to get a jump start on the Vampire Academy television show, the books are a great place to do that. But otherwise, it should be coming within the next year. So enjoy that. Also, this just happened mere minutes ago, right before I was going to hit export, so I'm adding this little bit at the end. But the mailman just arrived, and he brought me this gorgeous volume, which my wife got me for my birthday this year. It just arrived, and this is the how to explain this? Once upon a time, when Dracula was published, there was about a year or 2 later, the story appeared in serialized form in a Swedish newspaper. But it was very different. It was still called Dracula and was, supposedly the Bram Stoker book, but the narrative diverges wildly. And this version of Dracula has just recently been rediscovered, and one of the foremost researchers who rediscovered it is a guy named Hans de Roos, who also just put this book together, which includes all of the original drawings that appeared in that newspaper illustrating the book, or illustrating the story. And so, and Hans went through and he colored them and gave them all kinds of new, he restored them from scans that he had done, gave them new color treatments, and they're very cool. They're very cool, and like I say, I just cracked this book open. So, special thanks to Hans de Roos for not only doing this, but getting this copy to me right around the Halloween hour. Yeah, so if you are interested in your own copy, it makes an excellent coffee table book or an excellent gift to the vampire lover in your life, who is probably you if you're watching this. But I'll put a link below to where you can purchase these. And yeah, thank you, Hans. I hope you enjoyed the episode. This is just one of a series of episodes that I'm doing called Your Vampire Project, which is meant to be of interest to creators who are creating either vampire characters or vampire stories or vampire worlds. So by all means, avail yourselves of many of the other topics that we discuss. The next one of these that we will be doing is called How Old is Old, in which we discuss the age of your vampire characters. And your main character, or your main vampire character, may not be that old, but likely some character in your story actually is. And how does their age and all of the things that they've experienced across their long life affect how they are as a character? So that will be next time on Your Vampire Project. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Ooh.